and I am DeSoto Brown, the Bishop Museum historian, speaking to you from Bishop Museum Library and Archives. And today, for Throwback Thursday, I'm just by myself. My usual cohort, Hadley, is behind the camera today.
Hello!
There's Hadley. You can't see her, but I can. So, what we're going to talk about today, or what I'm going to show you today, are magazines. Now, print magazines have been in existence for hundreds of years, at least since the 1700s in England and other parts of Europe and the United States too. And today, of course, magazines are still with us, but print editions have diminished a great deal because a lot of us just get our news and information online rather than from pieces of paper. But let's look at some of the magazines that have existed over the years. Now, first of all, there have been and continue to be local magazines. And here's a magazine from the 1960s, which was called Beacon, and published probably up into, I can't even remember, the early 70s, I believe. Beacon was kind of a magazine of local interests, local stories, local gossip, you might say. And if I remember correctly, it wasn't something you subscribed to, but I think they sent it to you if they decided that you were the right demographic, meaning perhaps that you had enough money for the advertisers to want to pay. Here's a magazine that's still, still in business, Hawaiʻi business. And one of the interesting things about magazines is the covers, because how do they choose to tell their stories? Because the cover of a magazine was always important when it was on a newsstand. You wanted to attract potential buyers. This is from early 1974, and it's talking about the energy crisis, or the gasoline crisis, which was a terrible problem back then, right at that particular moment, early part of that year. And so you see on the cover a gas station, and if you look carefully, the price of the gasoline on the pump is 52 cents a gallon. And at the time, we thought that was an outlandish increase in price because it had been like 38 cents a gallon. Well, there's a magazine cover for you. Now, the best known, I think, of our local magazines was the predecessor of one that's still with us today. Honolulu Magazine is still with us today, but that originally started back in 1888, and it was originally kind of a tabloid newspaper size thing before it became a magazine in the 1890s. And for a long time in the 20th century, before it started using photographs on the cover, which began in the 1940s, Paradise of the Pacific had really beautiful artistic covers. So this one is from the 1920s, and let me look at the date. It's July 1923. So at this time, what they're emphasizing is the patriotic Americanness of Hawaii. So there's the Iolani Palace, of course. There's a Hawaiian flag, but above all of that, well, there are two Hawaiian flags, but above all of that in the center is the Stars and Stripes of the United States, because this is the issue that would have been available on the 4th of July. And among the many beautiful Paradise of the Pacific covers, this one's 1936. Has a beautiful surfing illustration by a man named Charles Bartlett. And Bartlett was a fine artist in addition to doing some stuff that was for commercial purposes. And this is a print that he made of surfers at Waikiki, which he sold as a print, and which also was reproduced, obviously, by this magazine. And not only was it used on the cover, but they also used it every year. The Paradise of the Pacific published a holiday annual, which had lots of full-page illustrations that people could save. And this Bartlett picture of surfers was also one of those pictures. And I might also add that it was used about that same time in the late 1930s as the cover of a national American magazine, which was called Travel Magazine. Speaking of national American magazines, now let's look at some of those. And it's particularly interesting to me when a national magazine chooses to do a story about Hawaii, because then you get to see what outside people think of us. So this is a 1952 edition or issue of House and Garden magazine. House and Garden, obviously, for people who wanted to have their houses and gardens look particularly nice. And in this issue, there are pictures of Hawaiian houses and gardens, or houses and gardens in Hawaiian Islands, let's say. And as usual, most of these are of well-to-do people's houses. These are architect-designed houses, and these are people who had particularly nicely landscaped yards. So here on this side is a photograph of a new home at that time, which was built on Noella Place, right in the shadow of Diamond Head, as you can see in the background. And it's a very 50s style home, very modern style home. And during this period, in the 1950s up into the 1960s, you find a lot of national magazines showing Hawaiian homes and trying to tell you that you could translate the same type of living into your home wherever it was in the United States. So they talked about lanai living, so that you had a place to work outdoors and to have barbecues and things like that. Here's a magazine from 1958. And of course, there are magazines for all different types of specialized audiences, different segments of society. And this is Ebony magazine, which was aimed at African American people. And it emulated Life magazine, of which I'm about to show you an example, which is an extremely well-known and very popular magazine throughout the USA at that time. So Ebony not only has a cover that looks like Life, but it also had a layout, and the type of news it reported was similar, but it was for black people specifically, as opposed to the general predominantly white or haole audience of the USA. So this is a young black woman who was from the mainland. She was from Virginia on the cover, and she was at that time, even though she was only 23 years old, she had a law degree, and she was teaching a law course at the University of Hawaii. So to show off that she's here in the Hawaiian Islands, not only is she wearing an aloha style garment, which was made by Alfred Shaheen, which is a very well-known manufacturer at that time, but if you look at the on the front of her car, on the front of her sporty MG, you'll see that there is a license plate that matches her garment. It is also red and white, and it says Hawaii on it. So there's a little hint of Diamond Head in the background too. So it's very clear that where she is and how pretty she is too, because they talk about that in the article. They even go so far as to give her statistics as to what her measurements were. That's the way it worked in those days, folks. Uh-oh. Anyway, so I just mentioned Life magazine, and here's an example of Life magazine. Life was published every week, large format, as you can see. Very, very influential from the time that it started in 1936 until it came to its stop in the early 1970s. I think it's 1974 they stopped publishing every week. But at its height, millions of copies, literally. I mean, there were something like 7 or 8 million copies of this magazine being published every week. That's an immense number. And it was not only American stories, but international stories. And particularly in its earlier years, this is where a lot of people got their news throughout the United States from looking at this magazine. So on the cover is a picture of the eruption of Kilauea Iki, which is a small sort of subsidiary crater near Halemaumau crater at the summit of Kilauea volcano. And it was a particularly spectacular eruption that occurred really without a lot of warning. Didn't last very long, only about a month or so, but the fountaining got up to over 1,000 feet high, and it got a lot of publicity because it was so spectacular. And as you can see, it got on the cover of Life magazine. So then you can see that it was a big deal. Well, throughout the 1950s, there was a lot of publicity in the United States about the Hawaiian Islands, particularly because this was a time when Hawaii was trying to attain statehood, and eventually became the 50th state in 1959. And this is the governor of the new state of Hawaii, William Quinn, on the cover of Time magazine, which was the leading news magazine of that time period. And in the article itself, something that you very frequently saw in those days was that they'd like to point out how modern and American the Hawaiian Islands were. So here's a wonderful photograph of the Windward City Shopping Center in 1959. In the background is the Foodland supermarket, which is still there. And there's a wonderful tiki-shaped sign that says Tiki Tops. That was the name of a restaurant. There was another restaurant in Waikiki called Tops This was a branch of that one, and it had a tiki motif, thus it was called Tiki Tops. And there's also, if I'm not mistaken, no, you don't see that, but not only is there the wonderful sign and the wonderful building in the background, but there are 50s cars, and also the women are dressed in typical 50s style mu'us, which were very voluminous and very large and colorful, which also at the time were considered very noteworthy throughout the United States because it was a fashion that nobody was wearing anywhere else, and it was what they wore in the modern new state of Hawaii. And also at about the same time, this is from 1960, the following year, Fortune magazine, which was, again, a very large format, substantial thing, and it was aimed at important men who were in business nationally. So this was meant for well-to-do businessmen, and it's talking about, at the time, and typically at the time too, it's talking about, again, the new state of Hawaii and its business prospects. And at the time, our economy grew really substantially from the time of statehood throughout most of the 1960s. So this photograph on this side shows you the modern, bustling, growing city of Honolulu with traffic problems and new buildings being built with Diamond Head in the background. And they like to emphasize, you know, there's a mixture of old and new. It's a mixture of primitive Polynesia and modern America and all that type of stuff. And these magazines very frequently have a similar type of editorial stance. And finally, oh, wait a minute, oh yes, finally, this is the final one. I don't need to have her again. Holiday magazine, which was an upscale travel magazine, and it too has an article on the modern state, new state of Hawaii. And interestingly, you see it has a American flag motif with the specific mention of Hawaii up here in the corner to show you, yes, it's part of the USA. And again, I really enjoy not only the editorial attitudes of what was written about, but also the photographs. And one of the things that's particularly interesting when you look at these magazines is not just what they chose to write about, but also the ads, because the ads tell a lot about what was happening at that time too. So the Hawaiian Islands, one of their unique aspects, of course, is volcanic activity. We saw the Kilauea Iki eruption. This one is the Kapoho eruption, which happened just a short time after the previous one that I showed you. And again, spectacular. It destroyed the small town of Kapoho on the Big Island. And that's something else unique in the new modern state of Hawaii here in our 50th state. So, that's just a little bit about magazines. Many, many magazines have been published. There's all kinds of, it's another of the things that I talk about. There's always a great deal more to talk about, and there's always a great deal more to the subject. But that's all for today. And again, this is coming to you from BishopMuseum, and I'm DeSoto Brown. And come visit us online, because we want you to come visit us in person and see all the wonderful things and exciting and happy things we're doing here. But if you can't come in person, or even if you can, come see us online too. And here's our website address, www.bishopmuseum.org, and see what's happening and the different things that are coming up that you can look forward to. But what you can also look forward to is next Thursday, there will be yet another Throwback Thursday with me, DeSoto Brown from BishopMuseum. And so until next Thursday, everybody, aloha.